Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Deeper as part of Abandoned Normal Devices 2021. My name is Luke Moody. I'm the creative director for this edition, and I'm joining you from London. I am wearing a red t-shirt, pronouns he, him, and I have a brown mustache. I'm going to be joined in this week's talk by the artists and architects behind WetLab. I'll be joined by Public Works and Assembly, including Carlotta Novella, Rhiannon Morgan Hatch, Hannah Fincham, and Ross Bennett. So welcome to each of you.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So the idea of this week's discussion is that we bring a little bit of context to the work WetLab, which will be in installation form at Ellesmere Port from the 11th to the 13th of June, 2021, from 10 until 4 p.m. It will be situated at Ellesmere Port, and then it will go to further sites, which we can discuss. Firstly, I realized you've worked together before as a team since 2014 on previous projects. I wanted to ask a little bit how that collaboration came about and how this project started to emerge together.
Who wants to jump in?
After you, Ross.
Oh, okay. So 2014.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name's Ross. Pronouns he, him. I'm wearing a white shirt and my black hair's tied up. Yeah, so in 2014, Assembly were also based in London, and we were working from an abandoned primary school in Deptford, South London. And I think it was Rhiannon who first came over to meet us and just like ask us what we were sort of up to. We were activating an overgrown wildlife garden and trying to sort of like bring it back into a community resource for the neighborhood. That was our first connection there. I think you were studying, weren't you, Rhiannon, at the RCA?
Yeah, exactly. So this is Rhiannon, pronouns her, she, wearing a white t-shirt, sitting next to Carlotta, also from Public Works. So I was studying architecture at the Royal College of Art in 2014, yeah, when we first met, and came over to see Old Tide Mill, where I believe you and Owen were living there, Ross, is that right?
Yeah. So a group of us were sort of guardians, custodians of the space, and we just realised it had like so much opportunity with this sort of playground and like an overgrown garden as well, and just sort of started to open it up and just discuss with the local community like what the use could be, maybe what their needs were in the local area. Like we were sort of surrounded by social housing and high-rise housing, and the closest park was probably about 15-20 minutes walk. So it was a really sort of beneficial spot of just calm and like, but also just sort of like away from what was a particularly busy and polluted like main road that was like a main sort of trade route through Deptford. So it sort of held all of these like amazing aspects and benefits for such a small space.
But also the site itself. Oh, and I'm Hannah, she, her, from Assembly, and I'm wearing a white silk top and I've got short brown hair. And yeah, so the site itself was under a lot of scrutinization from developers, and they were like placing all their valuation over it, and that it's we actually did a project, funnily enough, called Garden Lab there, and it's sort of similar in the way that it's sort of about putting a sort of more human value on a space, or more emotional values, or sort of just looking at things differently, really.
Yeah, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on. This centrality of like the civic and being embedded in the place seems really central to the work that you're doing. But firstly, going back to WetLab, it is, as it sounds, it's a laboratory that is on water. At least the underside of it will be wet. And it takes the form of both the in situ kind of architecture, the floating architecture, but also a parallel website where there are resources, there are manuals. And unfolding over the weekend, there will be a series of workshops, laboratories, talks, experiments with the public. Maybe Carlotta, could you describe a little bit the form that it will take and the inspirations that led to this point?
Absolutely. So my name is Carlotta from Public Works, she, her, and I'm wearing a black top and I'm joining from London today. So responding to your question, what the WetLab is going to be, as you said, Luke, is it's both digital and physical. So the website becomes this archive that collects what we're going to be finding out through the physical form of the different workshop and events that the lab is going to be hosting. So it's going to be a floating pontoon structure that is using modular pontoon to live on water with a timber infrastructure on top. But as part of this timber infrastructure, there are both an area for workshop and meals and gatherings, and a hut, which is a stove that is looking at alternative biomass or improved biomass rocket stove that is using briquettes that are using material coming from the canal as a fuel. So already in the kind of form of the WetLab itself and how we can have this stove on site, we're already starting to look at those resources that the canal can produce, which perhaps we don't yet identify as resources as much, but through conversations that are going to be happening in the lab, we will start identifying and start describing or start discussing around this type of objects or items. So a lot of, when we started talking about what the WetLab was, there was a lot of conversation around, of course, resources and tools. And what type of tools do we require as designers, artists, experts, citizens to explore canals and waterways, but also understand how much canals and waterways can offer to us and how we can respect them, clean them, keep them and care for them. So a lot of this element of care is something that the WetLab will be looking at each stop in according to a different theme, going from what is on the surface or what's under the water to the different ecosystem that populate the canals. And we will be joined by different collaborators, both international, national, and hyper-local to the different stops of the WetLab, who will help us develop these different themes, but also develop specific workshops and events and collecting data and information around the waters where the WetLab will be moored, let's say. It's important to point out that the WetLab is also a structure that won't be traveling on water across the different stops, but it's completely modular, can be taken apart and placed again in a different site. And this is to kind of make sure that its life could perhaps continue after the stops, and for an ease of maintenance of the structure. But yeah, maybe Rhiannon, if you wanna.
Yeah, maybe just quickly. This is Rhiannon. I think very, very initially we were really interested in this idea of a kitchen as a way to explore both food and materials. So this kind of dual functionality of what the kitchen can offer as a space to experiment, but also to kind of has a generosity to it that kind of invites people to spend time with the canal and that environment. And we were quite interested in this kind of dual function of the kitchen and the stove, which is kind of, we will be hosting a meal with kind of experts and local communities, kind of thinking about, are there foods that can be foraged from the canal? How can kind of soil remediation help to grow foods in the future along the canalways and things like that?
or what kind of foods can be found in the canals which are not identified as foods yet, such as weeds, or such as pennyworth weed or duckweed, which in the UK we don't yet perhaps see as materials that can be edible, can be used for edible purposes, but in other countries there is a lot of expertise and knowledge around using this type of weeds that are normally regarded as infestive weeds, and instead have lots of protein and good nutritional value. So we're going to be at National Waterways Museum specifically, we will be hosting a meal that is going to be all about pennyworth. And yeah, we're going to see how that flavor will go down with the local groups that are going to be joining.
Yeah, in a way, I was thinking when I saw the initial plans that you shared and the final design, for me it made me reminisce of kind of archaeological digs in a way, the base elements of human life and sedentary human life, this the hearth and the interaction with a body of water or a resource. Can you talk a little bit about the design of the hearth and how that evolved, what kind of research you were looking into?
Mm-hmm. For what concerns, so the hearth, in terms of the way in which we ended up using a rocket stove as part of the hearth, it was very much around the understanding of the type of technologies that which we use these days that can be more sustainable, and they present an alternative to, let's say, forms in which we would warm up food or heat up spaces in the past. It's also really interesting the kind of connection, historically speaking, of the role the canals had within the coal mining industry, especially in the north, and how in a way this kind of hearth and how it generated, and it's kind of moved away from, it's tried to kind of provide an alternative of looking at fuels and forms of combustibles that perhaps are more natural and sustainable, and they come from nature, but then they can return to nature. So the idea around the hearth is that it forms a full cycle in a way, going from the material that is used for the briquettes to kind of they then get combusted and form the fire, and they are able to heat up and cook food, but also through the food waste that is produced through these meals, and also through the ashes and that gets kind of then transformed into biochar, can be all become partly fertilizer that can be reintroduced within soil. So to develop this part of the project, the hearth specifically, we seek the help of an expert of appropriate technologies that's called Joshua Guinto, and he's based in the Philippines. And we found him almost by chance connecting to the different open source like websites of a lot of people around the world that share expertise and knowledge around rocket stoves and improved biomass stoves. And he's helping us to develop the stove, but also with the stove comes briquette press, a solar dryer, and a number of other items that allow the stove to survive and run. So that's for the heart.
Yeah, and what activates this space is obviously the series of talks and workshops and your presence, and that kind of brings us back, I guess, to this idea of the civic and this idea of that architecture having a role to bring something out of a community that perhaps wasn't there before, an interaction with the landscape, or maybe wasn't there before, but to draw it out through conversation. Maybe Hannah and Ross, obviously there are artists, architects, scientists, engineers and cooks, as you mentioned, who are going to be present as part of these workshops. Could you talk a little bit about that, the idea of like the citizen science that you mentioned on the website, and the importance and how you're working with the local community to lead those workshops?
Yeah, well, it's sort of just like the idea of sort of getting underneath the skin of things a bit, really. Like, so you can almost see science, and we like this quote that scientists and artists really are like the same. They're both sort of exploring, sort of noting down what they find, and it's just about the way you interpret it. And so, like, we've got such a mixture of collaborators across the project that everyone's input's really going to mingle into this one sort of view of the canal. And yeah, the idea of citizen science is just really like, is the idea that everyone and everyone's involvement sort of feeds into something, and even like the smallest little observations become really important. So actually, it's funny, you know, since the internet has been around, discoveries have been made about certain animal behaviors simply through people uploading their videos to YouTube, and so like this mass observation sort of brings out new patterns and new trends, which it wouldn't have been found if it wasn't for the fact that all the people are interested in things, and people are sort of guiding what is being, you know, focused on. So yeah, bringing it back to WetLab, yeah, we just want to sort of create many ways of looking and experiencing the canal.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I think like there's something about like one of our stops, the theme that we're taking on is the invisible, and it feels like a nice point to go off, seeing how, you know, the canal was designed as this sort of like artery for industry, and yet like a lot of the people we're inviting are like more on the domestic or like care space, and you know, a part of society that was quite invisible and sort of remains to be so in so much of today. So it would be really nice to just sort of see how people start interacting with the you know, the platform, the pavilion, and just from those like invitations.
Yeah, and in a way, I mean, in your literature, you mentioned that the canal is seen as a kind of infrastructure, as a highway in a sense, and the care for that, just as the care for a pothole in a pavement takes place out of sight sometimes, happens at night quite often. Therefore, it's less visible. That there is a need for intervention to take responsibility and look after that landscape for all of us. But in a way, what you're doing, I guess, is trying to make that public and trying to make the shared use and responsibility of it more open and more involving for the community that's immediate to that space. I wondered, like, just in terms of going back to the structure of the platform, if you could talk specifically about some of the workshops that will take place, and the use of that space, because they range really from, you know, like the creation of materials, to very craft-based, to conversational discussions. Will they be situated on the platform itself? Are you using the tables on there, or is the idea that it kind of permeates and leaves a structure too?
Yeah, I guess I'll chip in. Yeah, we're really kind of seeing WetLab as the main kind of focus. That's always the kind of starting point and the ending point, I suppose. But we really want there to be a way for us to kind of survey the land, survey the kind of wider landscape, going on walks, kind of listening to people who kind of live and work in the area, who can teach us about, you know, where the wild garlic grows in the kind of springtime. We've been speaking to a group in Nelson who have been convening kind of with Super Slow Way, the other commissioners, and their kind of richness of knowledge of that area already, you know, where the apple trees are, where there's a single fig tree next to the supermarket, was really, really rich. And that's just from an online conversation. So we're really hoping that it can allow for these kind of other conversations and kind of routes around the local area to happen as well. And also we've been, as well as the kind of more kind of static part of WetLab, we also have been developing this idea around like this mobile unit of that we've named the Canal Clinic, which is kind of designed in collaboration with some of the collaborators like Compost Mentis, who are going to be testing the soil for pollutants with us. And also the Canal and River Trust will be kind of looking at the different levels of kind of pH, oxygen, and things like that in the water. So the idea is to kind of have this kind of more mobile element that can kind of enter into the landscape a bit more and kind of become a place of curiosity for people who might not know about the project or have seen it, and just kind of allow for those kind of unexpected encounters to happen as well.
Yeah, and I guess just on curiosity, the beauty of a project like this, which is so responsive to a space and its community, is that it can also enlighten your own curiosity. And there's a discovery of, local knowledge, local experts who you may not have imagined to be there and to have encountered. Could you maybe talk a little bit about any kind of learnings through this process of collaborating? Obviously, Ross and Hannah, you've done a garden lab before, but were there any surprises on the journey just in terms of the resources that canal offers and learnings through putting together the program?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Well, I'd say that something I've been surprised by is because we, in our practice, we've already been exploring a lot to do with the edible wild food that you can find, and the plants that sort of become visible to you when you suddenly know how to use them for food. So I thought that we were getting to know plants, and like we had a good idea of what was going on, and then we started speaking to Julie. What's her surname now?
A weaver.
Yeah, a woman from Lancashire who is going to do a weaving workshop with us, and she just sort of offered us a whole another way of looking at plants in terms of like their actual physical makeup. If you dry a plant out, you can sort of strip away the core, and you're left with these fibers. And so you start to see the way a plant breaks down and how it can then be used as materials. And so that kind of has given us like a whole new way of looking at plants. And I quite like this phrase that people use. It's with sort of in the foraging community, people use the term the green wall, which is before you really start getting to know plants, a bank or like a canal bank or a verge or something, it just looks like a green shape, like a long green strip. And as soon as you start to get to know a few more plants, all these shapes and details start to reveal themselves, and people say like, oh, you've made it over the green wall because you can see the shapes within a thing now. But I didn't realize there was, that the depths to that just keep on going. So that was nice.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Were you going to say something?
No.
And obviously you're traveling to different sites with this project thanks to the partners Super Slowway and Canal and River Trust. Carlotta and Rhiannon, could you speak a little bit about both the beauties and also the difficulties of having to work on very different kinds of canal landscape?
That's a good question. Is a good question because it's really interesting because the structure is in building at the moment. So a lot of those questions are like we are grasping with them still right now. And I think there's, of course, because the canal has his own shapes, his own curves, and in each site there is a topography that changes, levels of water that changes. And also one point that was raised that through one of the conversations that we've been having, especially with Canal River Trust, the fact that when you are arriving with the WetLab and the WetLab gets installed, you ultimately will affect to some degree the ecosystem where the WetLab will be placed. So it's about like having that understanding that even us parking the WetLab there, we are impacting, and how do you avoid to impact too much and arrive in a gentle way. So I think there were a lot of conversation have been held around the type of floating pontoons, so the structure and how we anchor to the ground, how we make the structure accessible. Some sites are a bit more accessible than others because of topography and the way the landscape plays out. But generally, it was really lovely to have the conversation with both Abandoned Normal Devices, the museum, the Canal River Trust, and Super Slow Way to identify the best spot, not only in terms of accessibility, but also importantly in terms of who is around us or who will be around the WetLab, which type of organization, which type of nature will be around. So one of the sites in Burnley, the third stop of the WetLab in the mid-July, will be at Finsley Gate Wharf, which is very close to the 1 mile stretch of the canal. There is a full straight mile, and it was an incredible engineering an incredible engineering infrastructure that was constructed for the town, but it also becomes a 1 mile of ecosystems to explore and look and walk through and go and see while the WetLab is going to be there. So each site is quite unique, going from the National Waterways Museum and all its vessels and boats that are displayed and stored, to sites, and there is more urban, let's say, to sites like the last one in Lee near the Pennington Flash, which is a natural reserve and has like a very large population of birds and a very extensive different types of flora and fauna that make a very unique natural landscape. So yeah, they are all slightly different, and that's how each one has a theme that kind of connects specifically to the site.
And I think just to build on that, I think the conversations that kind of emerged and were ongoing with the different project partners really helped to form what WetLab became, because I think we became like increasingly understanding that it's not often that you see anything but a boat, a barge, or something like that on the water. And so it just took a while to kind of understand that we actually had to really design within those that was our limitation in a way, is kind of how do we exist as a boat but kind of question what that kind of traditional role is as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of taking that footprint, but an entirely different function to what's normally encountered on a canal. We are coming to the end of our time together for this week's Deeper. So WetLab will be situated at Ellesmere Port, the National Waterways Museum, 11th to 13th of June, and then it travels onwards. You can check out the resources and the evolving resources as the project travels to each site at wet-lab.net. And on the Abandoned Normal Devices website. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in real life in Ellesmere. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much,
Perfect.
Luke.
Thank you for hosting, Luke.
Yeah, thank you.